Hello, everybody. This is Sega Saturn Reviews, and today I'll talk about the history and importance of CD based gaming. Hope you have a good time, and let's get on to the video. So, back in the day, it was hard to make a video game console. You had to have special cartridges that didn't store much info and were kind of hard to make. So, in the old days, there were really only 3 consoles at a time. But then, in the 90s, a ton of new consoles popped up. Why was that? Well, if you notice, the new consoles mostly had CD players. But what does that have to do with anything? Well, let's see what the British TV show Bad Influence had to say about CDs.
Lots of reasons why software on CD is taking over the world. They're a lot cheaper to produce than cartridges or floppies, and they're very difficult to pirate. But the main reason is that a single CD can hold as much information as 80 cartridges or a staggering 800 floppy disks.
And that means you can store video footage directly onto the disk.
Thank you, random British TV show. As you can see, they were able to hold a lot of storage and were also easy to mass produce. So companies thought they could make a new console with a motherboard, BIOS, and a CD player, but that wasn't how things worked. You couldn't make a SNES clone with a CD player and expect it to work, right? Oh wait. Well, let's see where this all began by looking at the first console to use CDs. In Japan, things worked differently than it did in the West. It wasn't Sega versus Nintendo, it was NEC versus Nintendo. NEC made the PC-98 line of PC computers, and happened to make the console we will be talking about. An add-on for their home console, the PC Engine, or the TurboGrafx-16 in the West, the add-on allowed for CD-based storage. It had a decent library of games, just mostly more what was on the main console. But this didn't start anything. It was a bit too expensive and not popular enough. Why get the CD add-on when the hardware itself wasn't changed that much? They weren't taking advantage of the extra storage space. Then we have the Philips CDI. It was a CD player that you interact with. Interactive CDs. Why? This thing created YouTube poops. It's that bad. It's just that bad. Didn't catch on because it just kind of sucked. It was just bad. I may not be in the right order for the next few, but the next year, companies tried CDs. I'm not sure this belongs here, but the Commodore CD-TV was released. But it is a Commodore computer with multimedia options. It didn't catch on because it was expensive. It has a similar price to a good gaming PC today. Sega later released an add-on for the Genesis, the Sega CD. It failed because of bad marketing and a bad price. Also, no one in the West cares about add-ons. Like, I don't get why companies never realize that. They just keep on trying to do that, but it never catches on. Out of order, I'm going to talk about the 1993 consoles that use CDs. Because this year started the generation of new consoles. Let's talk about the FM Towns Marty, the first 32-bit console, and it's a stripped-down computer. The FM Towns is a PC line that competes with PC-98. Oh god. No, 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 no. Michael, don't leave me here. As I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, the FM Towns can compete with the popular PC-98. And the FM Towns Marty had a version for cars, oddly. More popular consoles didn't even get that, but this was the start of a bunch of consoles being released that were simple and had a CD player. And oddly, Nintendo didn't even have a CD console during this time. They tried, but ended up partnering with the CDI instead. But when they tried, they ended up angering Sony, who they wanted to partner with, and they made a SNES clone with a CD player and better hardware. But we'll get to that anomaly later. Let's talk about the 1993 to 1994 consoles. In 1993, in terms of CD consoles, we got the FM Towns Marty, which we talked about, the Amiga CD, which failed due to debt and bankruptcy, and also being banned from entering the US for some godforsaken reason. The 3DO failed due to having a high price and just not being able to keep up with Sony or Sega, and one of their manufacturers just backed out. Then you have the Neo Geo CD, which was a Neo Geo, but they replaced the cartridge slot with a CD player to save money. But in the 32-bit era, you couldn't release an underpowered console and expect it to sell solely because it has a CD player. The next one is PCFX, which now earned the name PC because it looks like one and can be upgraded like one. It is the sequel to the PC Engine and was expensive, but couldn't do 3D for some reason. They made a big, bulky, expensive console that couldn't do 3D. Why? Who thought this was okay? You went from ahead of the times with the first CD console to behind the times in a few short years. Now, the two people care about, the Saturn and the PS1. The Saturn didn't fail in Japan, it sold more units than the N64, but it failed everywhere else because it was pretty much designed solely for Japan, making it hard to sell. Like the Sega CD, it was basically designed for Japan. It also was hard to develop for, but that didn't stop developers in Japan from making a lot of shovelware. The PS1 succeeded everywhere because Sony was a well-known name and had a lot of money for ads, and they used technology from their other products. They also got third-party support stolen from the SNES because the Sega Saturn was hard to develop for, and the N64 wasn't released yet. As you can see, the PS1 takes heavy inspiration from the SNES and its controller, which was based on the SNES controller. The controller was a good selling point because of how well designed it was. And finally, we have the add-on for the Atari Jaguar, which was already failing, and this add-on did nothing to help. It didn't have many games and it made it look like a gray toilet. It was also late to the market, similar to the N64. Some Eagle Eye viewers may see that I left some consoles out, because they were edutainment consoles, so let's go over them. We got the VIS, sold by Radio Shack. It could run modular Windows, but the version they used had no software ever made for it. The Viz was expensive, but it would only be enjoyed by young children. Why make a big investment out of something your kids will grow out of? Didn't sell well due to all those reasons. In 1994, we got the 8-bit Bandai Palladium, which failed due to being 8-bit and Bandai trying to rely on properties they owned. They were kind of edutainment and interactive movies, but you couldn't really get a console to rely solely on that. Now we have the Hyperscan. Not really edutainment, but made for young kids. A cheap console made by Mattel that is very much clearly cheap. It could barely run anything, and its whole gimmick was buying cards for games. It was like loot boxes in 2006. This is a terrible idea for a terrible console. Everything was terrible. The controller, the look of the console. Now let's move on to the last quote-unquote edutainment console. The VTech V-Flash is edutainment at its peak. It is a sequel to the V-Smile, but it didn't gain much from being on CD, and it didn't sell well, and it didn't get many games. All these failed due to being a console that's kind of expensive, and is meant for young children, but they won't be young for very long, so I don't get why you'd spend that much money. Because as soon as that kid turns older than 10, they won't use this anymore. Then you have a waste of space your kid doesn't want to use. CDs didn't just affect console gaming, it affected PC gaming as well. Instead of using slow floppies or zip disks, they started to use CDs, which was revolutionary. But they're still too expensive for some, so it was popular to use zip disks or floppy disks into the late 90s and early 2000s. But some software did come out before that time, like some DOS games. The FM Towns and some models of PC-98 also used disks, so did many Windows 95, 98, 2000 personal computers. Instead of having Windows 95 on a ton of floppies, you could get it on one CD, which helped PCs become easier to use and helped lead to the popularity of the internet in the early 2000s. CD gaming on Windows was weird. If you would have a disk and it would copy onto your PC, but it needed the disk to be there or else it wouldn't work. Oddly enough, my school didn't have CDs until the early 2000s, and when DVDs became popular in like 2001, my school didn't have them until 2007. Makes sense for a small little farming community in the middle of nowhere. CDs fell out of use when DVDs became popular, but CDs were still used for music. But there were other types of CDs that thought would take over, but DVDs were the same size and had good video qualities, so they were the ones to stay. You would still find CDs, but people ultimately replaced them with MP3 players and DVDs for most uses. Speaking of other types of discs, I forgot one console from 1993, the Laseractive. It could play Laserdiscs, karaoke discs, CDs, and console games. It had add-ons that allowed to play Mega Drive and PC Engine games. It was a crazy machine, a true relic of the 1990s. I might make another video about consoles that refuse to have discs. Non-disc gaming in the era of discs. The CD gaming era was fun. I kind of miss all the different consoles we got and all the cool computer games we got. Have a good day, and see you next video.